Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the PMP My Pod podcast number 2. Today, we are going to talk about a few, hopefully quick, introductory concepts to help you with your first set of workshops. And we're going to be talking about things regarding pediatrics. So, hopefully, you'll enjoy this section as much as possible. I really enjoy working with kids, and there are some things that are helpful when you're doing your first meetings with kids. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is in regards to the white coat. So white coats are off limits for kids. So when you see a kid in clinic, take off your white coat. I generally use this rule up until start their teenage years. And once they're a little bit older, then it's okay if you tend to leave your white coat on. But no matter what, in your clinics, basically take your white coats off. It's scary for little kids. Imagine you've heard of white coat hypertension, and you know that with kids, it could be even worse. The other thing is for you to stay at eye level with your kids as much as possible. Get down to their level and talk to them. Be happy in a nice, smiling way. Generally, a good idea. That looks kind of evil, but a happy, slightly higher pitched voice than what you might normally do. Speaking to the child and not ignoring them is really important. So think of the child as your patient, but you want to make sure that even though they can't always give you a good history, you can then ask the parents. Now, the next part of this is really about the parents. And if you think of this a little bit like veterinary medicine, some kids won't talk to you, and of course, you're going to have to get history from them. The other part of this is that you want to know the parents' names. Okay, so parents have names, and as a parent of two children, I have oftentimes been referred to as my child's parent as opposed to my actual name. So get names from everybody. If they bring in siblings, it's a good idea to get their names too. You never know; they might become your patient next. The last thing I want to mention just really quickly about the pediatric exam is really about activity. So you want to watch the child as much as you can, and that means walk when they walk in, while they're in the room, when they walk out. You can get a lot of information just by watching what they're doing. Okay, so that's about the pediatric exam. I think that will hopefully help you kind of in general. You're taught in your CM&R class to tell everybody kind of what you're doing at every stage of the game, and that may not be possible for your child to say to them what you're doing because they may not understand language yet, depending on their age. It is helpful for the parents, obviously, to know. The other part of this is especially for young children, it might be worthwhile to schedule them at certain times of the day. So if you need to be able to manipulate the child, like you'll learn about clubfoot casting, better to do it before they've had a nap. So ask the parent to wait for them to nap so they're kind of tired. Sometimes waiting for them before they've had a bottle. So if they come kind of hungry, they can actually drink from their bottle. If that means breastfeeding, then so be it. That can happen sometimes too. And also occasionally, especially for little kids, it may be worthwhile to have to examine the child in the lap of the patient, in the lap of the parent, as opposed to putting them on the cold, scary exam table. Okay, so let's move on now to some concepts in anatomy and biomechanics that I hope will help you. So one thing to remember is about pronation and supination. So we're going to review this really quickly. Closed kinetic chain pronation and supination are important concepts for you to remember, and they will have significant effects on your kids and what happens during those during their examinations. So you remember that closed kinetic chain, that's what we're going to be talking about. Closed kinetic chain, that means you're standing on the foot. So closed kinetic chain pronation consists of subtalar joint, that is subtalar joint pronation, will consist of eversion of the calcaneus, and then adduction, and plantar flexion of the talus. Okay, and you remember that means that you'll get internal rotation of the tibia as well. Okay, so that is the way we describe that. I'm going to tell you is going to be changed in a little bit. And then supination, of course, is the opposite. So you're going to have calcaneal inversion, which will have the talus dorsiflex and abduct, while the tibia will externally rotate. Okay, so those are concepts that you've already learned before and you should remember. So I want to introduce a couple of concepts that might be a little bit on the new side for you. So what we have here are a few different images, and let's start on the top left side. So this is termed the calcaneal-pedal unit. Calcaneal-pedal unit. And what this is showing in this image is that if you think of this as the talus, the tibia, and the fibula being one kind of unit, let's change that color a bit. So this is one unit. This would be the tibio-talofibular unit. And then we have the rest of the foot, which includes the calcaneus and the rest of the midfoot and forefoot. That is the calcaneal-pedal unit, or the CPU. And in reality, you have these two moving together, and we have taught you in school so far as if when you're standing, the talus is the thing moving and the calcaneus is the thing moving. And in reality, the talus and the tibia and the fibula are all locked together in a sort of fork, and the talus doesn't move. So I want you to keep that in mind for a second. The talus does not move. It can't. Maybe just a little bit, but for the most part, it doesn't move. Okay, that means that when you're standing, that same movement that we had described before is actually the foot moving around the talus and not the talus moving. So if you have talar plantar flexion and adduction that you would see in pronation, what you're actually getting is that the calcaneus is everting and the rest of the foot is then rotating externally, abducting and dorsiflexing around the talus, which is staying the same. And as a result, the talus then looks like it has plantar flexed and internally rotated. And that is not true. You can't actually recorrect the foot by moving the talus. It just doesn't work. Okay, so the reason why the tibia internally and externally rotates is because the talus is attached to it. And when the foot supinates or pronates, it's actually moving underneath the talus in supination, or it's moving out from underneath the talus when you're pronated. And then the talus can then sort of plantar flex and the foot's moved out of the way. The tibia can internally or externally rotate. Now, the reason that can happen is because of this concept of the acetabulum pedis. And you can see in this picture here, this is a dorsoplantar image of the foot with the talus removed entirely. And you're looking at the three facets of the subtalar joint. So you've got the posterior facet, the middle facet, and the anterior facet here. Okay, and so we've removed that talus. Now we're looking at what is essentially the almost like the acetabulum of a hip. It is almost a ball and socket joint. It's not completely a ball and socket because it has some restrictions, but it is really where a lot of this rotation occurs. So the subtalar joint moves to some extent, and the acetabulum moves to some extent. And so this is called the acetabulum pedis. Okay, now if you put these two things together, thinking that the foot moves as a unit, the talus is part of the leg and not of the foot per se. It has connections, obviously, that connect the talus to the rest of the foot through various ligamentous complexes that you already know. And you have this ability for the acetabulum pedis to move, to rotate. Now you can actually create a foot that is going to also be termed something that may be new. This is called the lamina pedis. Now, if you think of the foot as being a flat plate, and you twist the plate, which is another sort of way that some people refer to this as a twisted plate. If you look at that, the normal foot has a certain amount of twist to it. And if we were sort of, kind of drawing things out, this area would be sort of the calcaneus. And maybe you might have the talus over here. And then you'd have the forefoot over here, okay? And if as we rotate that in a normal foot, you can see you've got basically a perpendicular rear foot and a forefoot that is perpendicular to the rear foot. And if you remember way back from your PMP 1 class, that is the definition of a normal foot: a rectus hindfoot and a forefoot where all the metatarsals are perpendicular to the rear foot. Okay, so that's the quote normal. And if you look at this now, a cavus foot has an inverted back part and an everted fore part. Okay, so that's for the forefoot. And if you think of this as essentially the first metatarsal plantar flexing, okay, so your first metatarsal plantar flexes, you're creating a forefoot valgus. So that's what eversion is, forefoot valgus. And then the opposite side of that, if the forefoot was to dorsiflex or invert, you are creating a forefoot varus. Okay, and then you have an everted calcaneus or posterior part. Okay, so really, if you think of this, we're going to see a lot of abnormal feet, and you're going to see pediatric cavus feet and pediatric planus feet. And if you think of the pediatric cavus foot as this essentially wound up foot, and the flat foot as being an unwound foot, then you can see where it's going to be sort of a goal to get from one to the other. And in cases and things such as clubfoot, you're going to see that what we want to do, we're going to have this cavus foot that is heavily rotated or twisted so that the forefoot is plantar flexed or in a valgus position. We're going to essentially eliminate some of that valgus position when we manipulate a foot and cast it. Okay, so that's some biomechanics. Let's now talk a bit about pelvic radiographic anatomy. So you're going to see in your lecture, if you haven't already seen it yet, that the pelvis has the particular parts, and it's important for you to know what those parts are so you can understand the description that the lecture gives you. So we're going to remember that we have the ilium, we have the ischium, which is this part. We have the the pubis, right? And this is obviously a hip radiograph of a immature or right pediatric hip. This will come together eventually, form the sagittal suture of the pubis. We have the femoral head right here. This is a secondary ossification center. So in a younger child, we would not be able to see that femoral head. And importantly, we have a section that is called the triradiate cartilage. So triradiate cartilage. And the triradiate cartilage, of course, is going to come together and form one solid bone. But in the pediatric patient, we're going to utilize this spot in order to find different lines. And you'll notice, so here, this area that I'm outlining, this is the most kind of inferior portion of the ilium, right? So that line is actually going to be what you're going to use when you're drawing things like the Hilgenreiner's line, which if you haven't watched it yet, you will see that the Hilgenreiner's line is running essentially right along the corners of these two. Okay, so that's going to be Hilgenreiner's line, or the Y line. It's another name for it. Y line or Hilgenreiner's line. And it becomes a pretty important line because it's going to help you to determine if the patient has a developmental hip dysplasia. And so this is a normal image, and you can see, for example, that the femoral head is actually below that line where the triradiate cartilage is, or where the tip of the ilium is located. Okay, so those are kind of your most important things that you need to remember, at least as far as anatomy, to help you with that lecture. And you're going to see in that lecture there's a few examples. My suggestion is you go through those examples yourself to help you learn those different things. Okay. So now let's move on to foot radiographs. And okay, so one of the things we have to talk about is the time of appearance. So basically, aging a pediatric foot by by looking at the X-ray. So that's going to be one of the things. And let's come down here for just a second. And I'm going to give you a mnemonic that I've liked to use that has worked out really well for me in the past. And this is a very odd one, but this is Cat Coleman. Maybe you can add an S if you want to, but so this is calcaneus. And this is talus. We've got the cuboid. We've got the lateral cuneiform. You can imagine what's going to come next. We've got the medial cuneiform, the intermediate cuneiform, the navicular, and then sesamoids, which come later. Okay, so this is going to be a way you're going to remember this, and how to make this work well for you is, let me just get rid of these, is think of this as these first three are present at birth. Okay, so what we're talking about is the start of ossification for different things. So that's birth. Okay, so the lateral cuneiform is going to be present at 1 year, the medial at 2 years, the intermediate cuneiform at 3 years, the navicular at 4 years, and the sesamoids will come later. It's actually a bit later that you really see them ossify, and they're finished ossification by about 15 years. Okay, so the S is not quite as important, so let's get rid of that just for the sake of ease of memorization. So if you think about this, you've got birth, 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, and 4 years. Now, if we looked at these, thinking about this, if we look at these x-rays that we have right here, these radiographs, remember that these are DP radiographs. There is no such thing as an AP foot radiograph. In reality, an AP foot radiograph actually equals a sesamoid axial. Okay, so if you think about that, if your beam is running from anterior to posterior, then the only way you could do that would be to get the sesamoids, essentially. You could do that with the ankle, and you can have an ankle AP. So that one's possible. Okay, so let's take a look at these. These are ones from children, and you can see that we have a calcaneus, we have a talus. Of course, we have a tibia and fibula, but we're not so worried about that part. We have a lateral cuneiform. Those are three largely formed bones. You'll also notice we have metatarsal shafts. And we have phalanges. Okay, remember the plural of phalanx is phalanges. So these are what's present at birth, except that the lateral cuneiform is at 1 year. Okay, now there is a very, very tiny little intermediate cuneiform that's right there. All right, and yes, there are variability, obviously. So those are the major bones that are there. Now, I would say if I was going to age this child, that this child is around 1 year old. Okay. Now let's take a look at this other one. So we have a talus and a calcaneus. We have a cuboid. We have a lateral cuneiform. We have a very small medial cuneiform, a very tiny intermediate cuneiform, and the smallest little navicular. Now, because those bones are not really formed, I would not consider those as significant in the age of the child. Maybe they're a little advanced in their bone formation, but those primary centers of ossification are not very significant yet. So I would probably say that this child is somewhere between 1 to 2 years old, only because that medial cuneiform is starting to form something reasonably significant. Okay. Let's take a look now at angles. So remember that there are a number of angles that you are supposed to know. And yes, you get to know them in this class. So remember a couple of things. First, when you are drawing the line to bisect a bone, you would be placing a dot on the shaft of a bone and a second dot on the shaft of a bone, and then you would measure the distance, cut that distance in half, and that would create your line. Okay, so you can see this is my bisection of my first metatarsal. And if I was doing the same thing, let's say on the tibia, on the talus, you can see that we have a talus that is running here. Okay, there's our talus. And if I was going to draw a line on that one, I'm going to have my little dots on the tailor head and neck, and then I'm going to bisect those lines, and I'm going to kind of eyeball it a little bit here for the ease of our demonstration. Okay, and now we have a talo first metatarsal angle. That's what this angle is. Talo first met angle. That's an important angle. On the lateral, that's called Meares. Okay, and obviously the closer to 0, the better. So we'd really like the talus to bisect the first metatarsal. So we're going to get rid of those now for just a second, so you don't have to see those. Okay, getting rid of all those. Remember that there is a talocalcaneal angle, so a talus. And on this one, I'm going to use the lateral side of the calcaneus in order to draw the lines to find the angle, because it's very difficult for me to bisect the calcaneus using the true, bisection. Okay, so that would be this is our kite or talocalcaneal angle. Okay, so kites or talocalcaneal angle. Okay. The one thing that I want you to keep in mind is that when we're looking at these angles on a pediatric patient, you have to keep in mind that these bones are not fully ossified. We don't have the full shape of what these bones will be, so it makes it a little bit harder. But for generalities and for discussing, how we're going to treat a child, I think these are pretty reasonable. Okay. We might also have something which is something called Engel's angle, which, if you look at this patient, if I was going to try to find a true, like a real metatarsus adductus angle, I would be using a dot here, a dot somewhere around here, can't really tell, a dot somewhere there, and then a dot somewhere at the fourth metatarsal base laterally. Right? I can't really do that. I can't tell for sure. These are very questionable. Okay, so instead, we're going to use something called Engel's angle, which at about 3 years old is possible to use. And we're going to bisect the second metatarsal, and we're going to bisect the intermediate cuneiform. Okay, now that should be within about 15 degrees, so similar to the metatarsus adductus angle, less than 15 is normal. We have this. Now, the thing I want you to notice is that both of these images are non-weight-bearing films. So if I'm going to read this and describe it, I would say this is a non-weight-bearing a DP and lateral radiograph of a skeletally immature individual showing X, Y, and Z. Now, because of that, everything is going to be different, and so these angles really are not very accurate. But for the sake of our discussion, I figured it was okay to use these. Okay, now coming over to the lateral view, remember that there are a couple of angles there that might be useful for us. So as an example, we have a calcaneal and talar angle, right? This is the Kite's angle on the lateral view. We have a talus and a first metatarsal, which I'm going to eyeball heavily here. Okay, so there's your talar first metatarsal angle. So they become almost, you can see that if you put some weight on it, that would pretty much equal almost a 0, right? You have in a weight bearing, you can have the talus and the tibia. You can have you could be looking at those bones and see, obviously you can look at other angles, but really we're looking at these kind of hindfoot angles and how the hindfoot relates to the forefoot. Okay, so those are your angles that you might want to know. Now let's talk about pediatric milestones. Your lecture talks about pediatric milestones, but it doesn't cover everything. It tends to go from the end of the first year on, and I want you really to know some things about the first year so that you can get some ideas. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind that you should know is that neurological development in pediatric milestones tends to be from the caudal, I'm sorry, from the cephalic to the caudal direction. So it's going to run, let's get another color there. It's going to run down this way. Okay, so cephalad to caudal, or head to toe. And that means you're going to lose primitive reflexes later the further you go down. Okay, so keep that one in mind. Okay, so the way you can remember this is about so starting at the neck, we have 3 months, and that is holding up the head. Okay. Okay, and then if you have a baby and you lay the baby on their back, and then you grab the arms and you try to lift the baby up a little bit, after about 3 months, sometimes a little bit later, maybe even closer to 6 months, even sometimes, the child will hold up the head and create neck flexion. Okay, that's normal. Okay, after 6 months, that neck flexion is abnormal. So in this case, we're going to say 3 months is early. Okay, then as we move down, we're going to call the trunk, that's our next part. So this is going to be rolling. The child should be able to roll over at 4 to 6 months. Okay, so as we go down, we've gone 3, now 4, and our next one is going to be 6 months. We're going to stay in the trunk for a bit. So 6 months, they're going to sit with support. So sitting with support. And that is sometimes called the tripod position. You've heard of this in relation to maybe somebody with respiratory disorder and they need to open up their chest. Okay, so as we then move up or down, as we move down the child, we're going to stay with the trunk, and now we're going to have sitting without support. So at 8 months, we're sitting without support. So all on their own. Okay, now obviously, again, some kids are going to start earlier than others, and some might be even a little later. So these numbers sound like they're black and white, but only because we need something to memorize, some way to sort of give us a general feel for it. But you should always think that there's some outside variation on both early and late on these. Okay, the next is 10 months. Now we're going to start moving down the legs here. So at about 10 months, we have what is called pulling to stand. Okay, the child's going to use the upper extremities, grab onto something, and then pull themselves up to stand. And then we get to 12 months, where they are now standing without support. Okay, and this is where they actually may start walking. Okay, and they may or may not, let's just say they might or might not need support. Okay, so walking with or without support. And then we're going to move all the way down, so let's say the feet at 15 months is walking independent. Okay, that means without support. Now you'll notice then that you could, in theory, you could have a child that could be a little early and start walking at 9 months, or someone as late as 15 months really walking independently themselves. Okay, then we're going to get to a few others which kind of get a little bit later, than your first year. So you've got 18 months, you've got running. I can tell you that both of my kids started running way before that. Then you start to have 2 years where it's sort of 2 feet to go up a step, right? So they go up both together and then take the next step. At 3 years, they are really moving along, so they're 1 foot for stairs, and they may even be starting to ride a tricycle. And then finally, at about 4 years, this is really where the adult gait pattern really comes into play. Okay, so if you see, you have this progression. So as they get neurologically and physically stronger, you move from the 3rd month to the 4th month, 6, 8, 10, 12, then 18 months, 2 years, 3 years. Oh, and I didn't mention 15 months after the 12. Okay, so there you have it. Okay, so those are your pediatric milestones around the first year of their life. Okay, the last topic that I wanted to talk to you about is about spinal dysraphisms, and these are problems where the spinal cord and the spine itself have not necessarily formed appropriately. And so we're going to talk about a couple of different things. All right. So the first one is going to be where this spinal cord, and we're going to draw ourselves a little bit of a spine here. 3, 4, 5 lumbar and 1 sacral. Here, that's kind of that's the sacrum supposed to be. We have the anterior here, and then we have our spinal cord, which we're going to make into a yellow. Okay, and I'm going to go back to red now. We have our spinous processes for each of those, and then we have the skin right on top of that. Okay, so this is an anterior to posterior view. Our spinal cord and column here, we're going to talk about the different types of spinal dysraphisms, and these are really going to be based on how much of whatever is coming out of the body. So we might have the first one, spina bifida occulta. Right, that means that there's nothing to see. There's no open dermal findings. Now, in some cases, you might have a tuft of hair. You might have a cafe au lait spot or a brown patch. You could have a dimple potentially. And in that case, what you're getting is just the lining. The lining staying the same, but we lose one of the vertebral spinous processes, and now you just have this space that is right in between. So that would be spina bifida occulta. So the spine is bifid, or in 2 places. Okay, now your next one, let's come down here and draw our new spinal column. We have our 5, there's supposed to be 5 vertebrae, and their spinous processes. Okay, and we have anterior and posterior. We have the skin, and we have our spinal cord. Okay, now, in this case, we're going to now talk about meningocele. And in meningocele, you have only the meninges sort of cropping out. So you create a cyst that is cropping outwards. And that means that we have, of course, we have since, let's say, lost one of our, we have a bifid spine, and that has allowed some herniation of um, of that lining of the meninges to come out, but there is, so this is just the meninges and not the spinal cord. Okay. Now, if instead we have a different process where now we start to bring the spinal cord into that cystic space, now we have a myelomeningocele. Okay, so in this case now, it is the meninges plus the cord. This is worse, obviously. So that is going to look like where this is starting to come out. And then potentially might maybe go back in, or maybe it just stays out. Hard to know. Okay, that's going to include both. So a meningocele is just going to include that, while the myelomeningocele includes both. Okay. Now, there are a couple of others that you don't hear too much about, but are worth knowing. So we're going to draw a new one here. And there's 1, 2, let's see, 3, 4, and 5. And let's say we are missing a spinous process. And instead of having literally one spinal cord, we actually have two of them. And maybe they come out or maybe they don't. So if there are two of them and there are two spinal cords, this is termed diastematomyelia, which means two cords. And if you have one cord, but instead, so we're going to take a separate section here. So if you have one cord, and this is the cord, and it has a separation or a cyst, this is called syringomyelia. And syringomyelia means a syrinx is a cyst or an opening. Okay, so you now have different layers, right? So you have the normal, you have spina bifida occulta, just the opening of the vertebral spines. You then have a meningocele, which may not necessarily be too bad, right? The meningocele was that it did not involve the spinal cord at all. It was just a cyst. Or you have a myelomeningocele, which is obviously worse because you have herniation outwards of the spinal cord. And then you have some variations or additions, which could be diastematomyelia with two cords, or you could have syringomyelia with the extra cord. Okay, so that brings us to the end. I hope this is helpful to give you the opportunity to approach the first workshop a little bit easier. If you have any questions, you let me know, and good luck on your first workshop.